Welcome to the Cults and Culting of America podcast. My name is Scott Lloyd, and Daniela is joining me, as always, the knitting cult lady. Daniela, I'm really excited about our conversation today. Joining us is Dr. Jamie Marich. And Jamie, I love your t-shirt, Jesus is just a detail. And I'm sure we're going to be hearing about that. But if you're not familiar with Jamie's work, go look her up. I did some of that today. Just incredibly helpful and fascinating content. Jamie, it's so nice to have you. Thank you for joining us.
It's my great pleasure to be here. I too am excited for this conversation.
And Daniela, most often, a lot of times, you're wearing a t-shirt and that has clever little things to remind us of where you come from. And Jamie was inspired. So Jamie, we'll open with that tonight. Tell us about your t-shirt and what inspired that.
Sure. So this line came to me when I was studying, of all places, in a yoga ashram, which I do write about in my memoir as my third cultish religion experience that I went through. Yet one of the reasons I was drawn to study yoga in the first place is I am deeply connected to the spiritual practices of India. And one of the teachings is this idea of what's called Sanatan Dharma, or universal truth. It's the idea that the things we have in common are the things that really matter. So things like love, the capacity to let go, etc. And when I first learned that teaching, a line suddenly came to me. Wow, all these things we squabble over are just details. Jesus is just a detail. Buddha's just a detail. Krishna's just a detail. The rules are details. And sometimes the details are important to people to help them get that larger spiritual connection. But how sad is it that we literally kill each other and abuse our children over what are essentially details? So that's where this line comes from. Jesus is just a detail.
It's so interesting to me because when we define like culture, right, sociologists sometimes will look at things that every culture does. And these will be things like create alcohol, even in cultures where it's illegal to drink. Infidelity and monogamous partners, we find in every culture, right? Creating art, right?
Yes.
There are these things that, like you said, like all humans have in common. All societies have figured out doing this, storytelling, all these different things. And those are the things that unite us. And I also think on the flip side, like, it's interesting because all cult scholars say in one way or the other that like all cults are ultimately the same. Like it's all the same and story. And I kind of remember realizing this when I read a book about someone growing up in Scientology and realizing like I had been stuck laboring under the idea that Christianity was the problem. And then when I actually recognized my childhood and specifically the labor in a Scientology kid, growing up in the Sea Org, I was like, oh, yeah, they're all the same, which for me is great. Then you just start looking at tactics and you break this all down.
Yeah, because where I've come to at this point in healing from how I grew up. So I think another reason this saying means so much to me, Jesus is such a detail, is I grew up with two parents who were devout in two different expressions of Christianity. I had an evangelical Pentecostal father and a Catholic mother who stayed married. My dad converted because they had been married Roman Catholic. He converted, expected her to come along. She didn't, but as a Catholic did not believe in divorce. So I was raised as the oldest child in this battle where I was just like, but wait, don't y'all both believe in Jesus? And it was like, no, because there were details about Jesus that got fought over. And so that's part of what the shirt means. And to your point about, is Christianity the problem? Believe it or not, after everything I've been through, I'm actually pretty cool with Jesus Christ or Christ consciousness. It's, what people have done in Christ's name that really pisses me off.
And that brings me to this point that it strikes me about your t-shirt and Jesus is just a detail, is that what happens in a lot of these groups, right? They're not actually concerned with the teachings or the life of Jesus. It's simply a means to an end, right? It's a detail that they leverage for control and manipulation of groups of people.
Well,
Correct.
and even from the cult perspective, like I was literally just arguing about this on threads today with people, where I say a religion cannot be a cult, right? A religion is an ideology, it's a story, it's a way by which you might live your life. Like, the cult is the group, and cults use religion. But I actually am like, I'm the opposite of you. I have basically no love for any religion. I'm just a neurodivergent atheist,
It's fine.
but I'm very like strict on this one with people, because I'm like, no, the religion is just the tool of the cult, right? And they can use, in my opinion, any ideology you can use to weaponize.
100%. And I think things that start out as innocent, spiritual, but not religious ideologies can become religious if you understand religare is the root of religion. That means to regulate, to have some kind of system in place. And yeah, I always say I'm a fan of what religion could be. It's often not used in, I think, good ways. But yeah, that's an interesting distinction, because I get asked all the time if certain religions are cults. And I know growing up with my father in his Pentecostal denomination, the tactic he used all the time was to say that every other religion on the planet was a cult.
Right.
And like this rule 101 of a cult, right, is to say everyone else is in the cult.
Yeah. And this is why when I say this to people, I always say, if you would have the conversation that every religious organization is a cult, right, especially in America, like, okay, but this distinction I think is important. I was wondering, would you give us like your elevator pitch of your story, and just for listeners who aren't familiar with your work?
So, by professional vocation, I'm a therapist. I specialize in the treatment of trauma, dissociation, and addiction. And since the beginning of my career, because I've been licensed going on 20 years, I have been interested in spiritual abuse and religious trauma as legitimate forms of trauma that we need to name alongside all the other traumas that get our attention as therapists. Yet, part of my interest in this is because of what I went through. And I guess to clarify, I always say to folks, I did not grow up in the kind of cult that you see in a Netflix documentary. However, I did grow up with, as I've mentioned, two very religious parents who were constantly at odds with each other. They were married Roman Catholic. Dad converted when I was about 5 years old. I was the oldest child. I witnessed all of it. I remember things very clearly when life just suddenly became a shit show, because Dad converted and then was trying to get everybody else to follow along with him. And I won't mention the specific denomination, although if you read the memoir, you can you can find out what it was. But I have met other people from that denomination, and even though I think some of the Pentecostal evangelical high control dynamics were at play within the denomination, I think some of my dad's issues took it to a uniquely abusive place. Because where he, I believe, needed therapy and legitimate health and healing, he found religion, and that just became the weapon of terror with which he finally had to hold over a lot of people in his life.
Well, and this is where, as someone from one of the cults that can't even get a documentary because people think it's so extreme.
Yeah.
I think that there's a certain kind of almost like crazier level sometimes with the everyday religion. So with like the documentary Shiny Happy People, and with Tia Leving's book A Well-Trained Wife, where it's like, I think some of these high control religions are these systems, but they hand the blueprint for how to be a cult, like, to your family. So Seventh-day Adventists are, I think, to me, are like prime examples of this. Like the religion in itself, like arguably fits the definition of cult, but single families within that can take it to even more of an extreme.
100%. And what I've come to learn is the fact that these are churches that show up on Main Street and people attend them who are highly distinguished members of the community is part of what can make it, I wouldn't say more insidious, but insidious in its own way. It can be covert. And a lot of the abuses I experienced were of the nature where I said, but I don't have it as bad. I don't have it as bad as this person or that person or people who are maybe in more extreme groups. But I knew something wasn't right, especially as a queer person who was coming up in all of this, that it was just not right the way that people were treated. And yeah, I think the tenets of this religion empowered my parent with a lot that ended up really harming me in the home. And something that I teach as a professional is spiritual abuse, religious trauma. It shows up in three basic power differentials. Leader to congregant is the most general kind of language I could use, because that could be guru, teacher, pastor, or priest to parishioner. And it shows up in different faith traditions. It can show up in the home, parent or guardian to child, or in family systems. And then, of course, at the level of the state. And I really applaud your TikTok content, Daniela, for going there with how things show up at the level of the state. So it's wherever there's a power differential, it can happen. And when I was a graduate student, that's when I first became interested in looking at, is spiritual abuse a real thing? Because that was the verbiage I used in my own heart and soul when I was going through the first stages of my addiction recovery, my trauma recovery from a dissociative disorder. Was, I think the biggest abuse I experienced was spiritual, but I didn't know if that was a real thing. So I still remember my first semester of graduate school going to the library and looking it up. And at the time, this was 2003, most of the literature that was written on it was about cults, what we traditionally conceive of as a cult. And even in looking at ICSA's kind of 14 characteristics of a cult, that's International Cultic Studies Association, something that struck me was I experienced almost all of these, but to maybe a level 3 or 4 on a level of 10, if you're thinking of like the sound dial, that they were, if most, if not all, were present, just perhaps on more subtle levels. And I think that that's when you get told things like, it's not so bad, or maybe you gaslight yourself to say it's not so bad.
That's a kind of a really good way to explain the nuance that I'm talking about, because when I say, I just have my 10 parts that I made with group behavior, the way that I can explain it, but I've got my 10 parts, and I'm like, if you're a 10 out of 10, congratulations, you're a cult.
Right.
And now I think the level of extreme, like once you get there, I don't think you have worse cult or better cult. I just think you have time, money, and impunity is what turns it up, right? The children of God had more time, money, and impunity than your cult did. And so it got more extreme. Scientology is a primary example of this, right?
And,
I think what gets lost here is that the cults aren't turned all the way up to extreme can still have these very negative effects on the individuals that are inside of it.
100%. And I can tell you this definitively as a therapist, that this term we sometimes use is covert sexual abuse. So an example of that is, a parent may not have sexually abused you in a genital way, let's say. Hope I can say that. But think of like Donald Trump. If she wasn't my daughter, perhaps I'd date her. Those kind of comments. And being made to feel that even as a child, your body is a sexual commodity, even if you weren't directly touched.
And as someone who grew up in pedophilia culture, right? Like
I read your story,
culture is so pedophilic, right? Like it's like, why are you obsessed with the sexuality of children?
And that was my story in growing up in this container. And so I know personally as the client, when I was, and I still am off and on as a client over the years, but I didn't have it as bad, but it's a lot of that talk that can keep it hidden longer and can still cause its own degree of wounding and pain. So that's how I got into doing this.
By the way,
go ahead.
Dr. Marich, you'll get a kick out of this. If you need a good example of this for your clients, Pete Davidson's newest special if you haven't seen it, it shows he like goes to admit to his mom as a 10-year-old boy that he thinks he might be gay because he's in love with
Right.
Leonardo DiCaprio. And she, as a Catholic, she just starts going to town on him, and she is saying the most like sexually abusive, explicit
Yes.
thing to her 10-year-old son, all through
Yes.
the name of kind of like, you know, this is not our
Mm-hmm.
values, this is not our religion. And it's like,
Yeah.
it's such a good example of just like, this is how purity culture is
Oh,
abusive, is
I
pedophilia.
will check that out because I totally agree. And one of the reasons I decided to tell my story is because there's a lot of deconstruction memoirs out there right now, especially from the evangelical or ex-evangelical perspective. But I really felt I had something unique to share because I went to both churches on Sunday morning for the bulk of my childhood, from about the age of 5 until 15 or 16. And I remember one time a friend of mine, their mouth just dropped. Like, that's how you mess up a child. Oh yeah, because it and I will say on this end of things, the Catholicism I grew up with was definitely a kinder, gentler Catholicism. Because I think, like with a lot of things, they're degrees. I like to tell people if I still consider myself a Catholic, I'm a Joe Biden Catholic, not a Clarence Thomas Catholic. And so I
Mm-hmm.
grew up with a bunch of Joe Biden Catholics, but then I ended up going to graduate school at very much a Clarence Thomas type place where it was just definitely cultic dynamics within extremely conservative Catholicism. And that was really what kind of caused me to totally look at what the hell am I doing? This is not me. This is not right. This is to me not of God even.
Dr. Marich, when
Yeah.
you told us about your father converting to
Mm-hmm.
Pentecostal, and when did it start showing up? Did it show up immediately in your life,
Mm-hmm.
causing you problems? And is there a specific example that you'd like to share that sort of illustrates that point?
Well, I just remember at 5 to 6 in that range, it was dad's not coming to church with Papa, we called him at the time, isn't going to church with us anymore. And then conflict just escalated around my house, at least conflict I was aware of. Uh, Dad was constantly trying to convert people, to witness to people. I was invited to pray the Jesus prayer around that age, but it wasn't an invitation. It was, this is what you're doing if you want to keep me happy. Uh, but I would, other than the escalation of conflict, both in my immediate family system and in the extended family, I know the first time I really felt something gross was when I was about 8. And the two of them were arguing over a Catholic doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, which is the doctrine that Mary was conceived without sin. And they were at the dinner table. My father was absolutely berating my mother. My mother was defending her long held family belief and her love of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And the two of them looked at me and said, Jamie, what do you think? And I was 8. I had no theological opinion on Mary other than the color of her blue dress was lovely. I liked the songs we sang about her. And it put me in then what became a very familiar situation. I'd be asked for my opinion, and I would have to answer in a way that hopefully helped me escape both of their wrath. But that was impossible because my dad he was the angrier one. So it was just easy to please him and deal with my mom's stuff later. I also grew up with a lot of rapture anxiety.
Yeah, me too.
A tale I tell in the memoir was at 11, the night that Iraq invaded Kuwait. This was January 17th, 1991. I did look it up when I was writing. We were in the mall, my mom and brother and I. My dad worked night turns, and we were outside Spencer's gift shop, if you remember those in American malls. And they always played a radio outside because they were trying to get the dancing flower to dance. But that night, this was obviously pre cell phones, pre smartphones. Everybody was gathered around the radio to hear the news. And end times talk was at an all time high in my house around in the early 90s, around the Gulf War. And dad had me convinced that Saddam Hussein was rebuilding Babylon and the rapture would be happening any day. And if I didn't watch it, I wouldn't make it, or my mother wouldn't make it, especially because she had rejected the true version of Christianity. So I had my first certifiable panic attack right there in the mall in front of Spencer's, because I thought the rapture was going to happen at any minute. And I just kept saying to my mom, like, you're not going to make it. 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 And I was definitely, she was the parent that I was and still am more attached to. And it was just not a cool way to grow up, to be told constantly that your mother, who you love and who is very dear to you in a lot of ways, is going to hell, and that you are going to hell if you follow her traditions, which were, arguably speaking, more organic to me to follow than his. So those are just kind of two examples. And then, alcohol, drugs, me realizing my sexuality, that's when things became a little more dramatic. But those two examples were kind of childhood impacts I noticed immediately.
Yeah, it's amazing how many of these groups I experienced the same thing at a very early age, just kind of freaking you out. I mean, I remember sitting in my United Pentecostal church on Wednesday evenings, and the youth were supposed to present these Bible lessons, in skit form, and they actually turned out the lights and would blow a trumpet, and then the lights would come back on, people would be gone, and I'm a toddler sitting there, and it's very traumatic, and everything that happens in the news becomes a doorway for them to preach to you that, if you don't live up to these particular standards or hold these particular propositional beliefs, then you're going to be left behind, and all of these horrible things are going to happen to you. And then on top of that, you're going to burn in hell forever. So it's very traumatic, and it stays with you.
And I related when you talked about the skits, because we had a lot of skits at Dad's church growing up. The play Heaven's Gates, Hell's Flames was a staple.
There you go.
Youth group, we would have the skits about what it was like to be left behind or to not make it, to be turned away. And now with... Go ahead.
I just say, do any of y'all just like really enjoy the signs of aging? Like, I'm getting white hair right now and I'm loving it because, like, sorry, I was just relating super hard to everything you were saying, because we had all of that in the cult too, with the skit and the Rapture. Yep. There's this video of me and 5 other white children rapping apocalypse Bible verses in downtown Rio. And now I'm just like, no. Someone actually asked me the other day, like, how can you look 20 and 50 at the same time? And I said, you know what? I think that's a good description for, like, cult survivors. I'm like, still kind of in my delayed adolescence, but also enjoying the signs of aging, and also just like doing whatever I want.
Yes, just all of that. Very, very, very much relate to
you about your dad. Do you think that your dad, like, your Joe Biden Catholicism wasn't high demand enough for him? Like, first of all, like, what do you think of your dad's kind of mental state as a therapist? And do you think, like, I think people sometimes go looking for these higher demand groups because they need that level of fervor. Almost.
So that's interesting. Two things I know to be true from what I've pieced together. He was involved before he converted with a Catholic movement called the People of Praise. He had mentioned them. I knew nothing about them until Amy Coney Barrett was confirmed, and I realized she was a part of that movement. And then I read about them and looked into them. Oh, wow. And there is, to be fair, a more charismatic wing of Catholicism. The university that I went to for my master's, Franciscan University of Steubenville, has worship nights that look more Pentecostal charismatic. So yeah, I do think that was part of it. But my dad's story is also pretty textbook in that he was laid off from work for about 18 months in the early 80s. And he would watch Jimmy Swaggart and Jim Bakker late night, the televangelists. And so professionally, it's pretty well known that times of transition, a job loss, divorce, death of a child, death of a spouse, yes, times when people are uniquely vulnerable, times when people are maybe looking for some kind of answer. That's when somebody who tells them exactly what they want to hear can swoop in. So I think there was a little bit of both going on with him. Yeah.
And so this division, did it lead you to the addictions? How did that look like as you became older?
Well, I think what fundamentally led me to the addictions is that I had so many feelings to feel that I wasn't allowed to feel because feelings would get me in trouble. And I have consistently been a very deeply feeling person. I also identify as somebody with a dissociative disorder. That was the accurate mental health diagnosis I eventually got. And I know that for me, as a kid who dissociated quite a bit and had this very vibrant internal world, once I found substances, it just got me there quicker, or was able to tone down those feelings that were just dying to get out. But I didn't, aside from some artistic endeavors I pursued as a kid, I really didn't have a way to get them out. And so knowing my addiction story, I would say I crossed the line when I was about 19. It was a year after leaving my parents' house. And at one point in my life, the story I told myself was, oh, because I fell away from God, that's why I
Mm-hmm.
developed a problem with alcohol. And it's like, no, you developed a problem with alcohol because you didn't know what to do when you were out here in the world meeting other people and deconstructing your beliefs. I also came out to myself at 19. That's when I knew very clearly that I was attracted to both men and women. Now I would say all genders. And I also had this moment in my dorm of having great freedom in one breath because I'm being honest with myself. And then in the next moment, complete dread that you're going to lose everybody you've ever loved if you do anything with this. And so I didn't start to come out to other people till many other years after that. And then I didn't come out super publicly in every area of my life till about 2015. So I think a lot of those were contributing factors to why I found substances appealing.
And what
Yeah, I think
ultimately gave you help to resolve those particular issues?
Well, weirdly enough, I first it was somebody I met in church. So this is why maybe it's hard for me to totally disparage all religion, because I did meet a woman through the Catholic Church when I was working in Europe. So I worked in Bosnia and Herzegovina from the end of, technically the beginning of 2001 to 2003. My family's Croatian background. I am now a Croatian citizen. I've spent a lot of time in the country over the years, and I stayed in Herzegovina, which is the Croatian part, for 2 years. And it was within the 5-year period after the Croatian Homeland War. It's called different things depending on who you ask. And so I taught English, I taught music for a Catholic church, and it was a Catholic woman who was there in her retirement, an American, who was essentially my first 12-step recovery sponsor. She was the one who identified that trauma was an issue for me and that, hey, here's what addiction is and here are some things you can do about it. So I met this incredibly lovely woman through church who to me is everything a religious person could be, in that she never once tried to preach at me. There's this line in 12 steps, which can be their own cults. I get it, especially in certain groups. But she just showed me also what 12-step recovery could be, something that meets people where they're at, something that is based on attraction rather than promotion. And yeah, I just started having some amazing conversations with her starting in 2001. And then I've been continuously sober since 2002. However, she told me when you go back to the US, you're probably going to need some trauma therapy. And she was right. And so when I came back to the US, I started graduate school. And then it was in graduate school, I realized, wow, Janet was right about needing more trauma help. And so I've been a client and a recipient of just very amazing trauma therapy ever since about 2004, which really helped me piece it all together.
I really just cannot emphasize enough getting the proper help.
Mm-hmm.
I love that, one of my biggest problems with 12-step programs is sometimes they discourage other forms of help, but getting
Which is
trauma
not canonical. Which is not
therapy,
canonical.
even getting meds, even
Yeah.
getting different things that work for you, I just think can
Right.
be so important in the healing, right? And like we all are doing this numbing behavior for some reason.
Yeah.
I was really relating to you. It's so funny how much I relate to addiction because for a long
Mm-hmm.
time I never identified that way. And then I
Right.
just realized, like, oh no, running until my body fell apart, like that
Mm-hmm.
was my dissociative. And literally, I used to say, like, that's the only thing that gets me to stop thinking, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and like all of these different kinds of addictive things that I had. And then it's once you
Yes.
start like treating the trauma,
Right.
that's what helps you get better.
And one of the models that a colleague of mine and I have advanced professionally in the last couple of years is this model called addiction as dissociation, which essentially says that chemical addiction or any kind of behavioral quote unquote addiction is just a continuation of the dissociation process because our brains can become very bonded to that state of addicting. I just wanted to explain what I meant when I said 12 steps discouraging outside help. It's not canonical. Technically, in the text of Alcoholics Anonymous and the founder, he actually encouraged folks that outside help may be needed. And so it's a classic example of people in 12 steps saying things like, you just need meetings, you don't need to go to psychiatry, whatnot. Because whenever somebody is struggling with that, it's kind of like that phenomenon of, did Jesus really say that? Let's actually go to scripture and see what we find. Because I think a lot of people put shit out there, and I'm glad you brought that up, that harms people. And that's not really what the program teaches. So
It's
that's my
funny, in the
piece on
army
that.
we would call it barracks lawyers,
Oh
and it's just
yeah.
like people would just say things like the amount of time I got told my blouse was too short because of pockets. And finally I started
Mm,
saying, I want you to highlight where it says pockets and put it on my desk because it wasn't
yes.
actually even in the regulation, it never showed up. But
Right.
people would swear. We'll probably get comments on here swearing that like, oh no,
Yeah.
and it's like there's what people forget sometimes is that a cult is not just a leader and then a bunch of equal followers, right? There's a
Right.
hierarchy, there's a thing called
Oh yeah.
routinization. As soon as
Mm-hmm.
people get involved, they start writing things down and building extra things and putting things to what got said. We had this
Yes.
example in the Afghanistan war where like David Petraeus, the David Petraeus, whom we worship,
Mm,
showed up and made one offhanded comment. What are we doing about XYZ? And then we proceeded to put just untold millions of dollars and high level military strategy
yeah.
behind this thing that was like never necessarily the intention, but it was like the
Yes.
leader said the thing and then the machine went to work.
So this is why I'm so glad you're using this idea of the culting of America and you're doing further writing on this, because another place this shows up in my world is in even the field of professional psychotherapy. To be clear, I am grateful for therapy. I love being a therapist. I love the therapy I received. And and the movements that form in psychotherapy around a founder, around a modality, it's all of this. So for example, I am a trainer in EMDR therapy, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, for those of you who are wondering what that is. And it's on the surface a pretty weird looking modality, yet I believe so much in it because it's the thing that really helped me. And as soon as I got into that world to get trained in it, my cult evangelical bells and whistles went off about the way that the founder, Francine Shapiro, was being put up on this pedestal and a lot of the cultic type dynamics. And it happens in other forms of therapy too. So much so that I've actually looked at Shapiro as a milder case compared to some of the others. But we have the same thing happen as well, where folks will intone her name. Well, Dr. Shapiro said, and I will literally say, show me, kind of chapter and verse, because her name gets brought in a lot but that to me shows the power of the founder. And
I
what
even
that
have
can
a note when
interfere.
I talk about the people who were like the grandfathers of cult studies, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, and so they in turn have their cult followings, right?
Yes.
Because of, I think, almost any of these things, especially if you think of what you were saying earlier about people in times of transition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those are the people that are easy to be targeted. And
Right.
then this thing that I've noticed, that you should be very wary of anyone that knows a lot about the bad guys, a lot about manipulation, which means in the world of therapy. And then I also
Mm-hmm.
think in the world of any kind of skills training, any kind of arts
Sure.
development, anything, you get these almost like cult structures where, like, I mean, any therapist that wants to knows how to manipulate their clients,
Sure.
right?
And
So
I
predators
will
show up.
100%. And I will say that academia is the biggest cult I escape from. Uh, and I am both grateful for academia and absolutely horrified by it.
I
Uh,
feel that way about the Army. And just
yeah.
today, somebody gave me an academic, because I was reading out, I'm
Mm-hmm.
writing the chapter on entrance costs and exit costs. And I
Right.
was talking about, like, there's a lot of entrance costs too.
Mm-hmm.
And an academic just wrote me a 7-part response that I related to so much as a 15-year-old ejected from a cult and as a
Mm-hmm.
28-year-old Army captain trying to fit back into the work world, that I was just like, please
Right.
let me quote you on this. And I just put it like directly in the book, because
Right.
the academic, like, what you lose to stay in and what you lose to get out. And honestly, I have a full 4-year GI Bill, and this is why I have decided to not go do a PhD, because I'm like, I just don't want to put myself back into this kind of high control environment.
I literally went running from my first PhD program. That's not an exaggeration. It was such a sense of your mind is not safe here. Who you are as a person is not safe here. Get the hell out.
Good for you.
And so, in talking about where cults show up, Daniela, so much so when somebody first mentioned your name to me, the knitting cult lady, I said, "Is there a cult around knitting that is out there now that I don't know?" uh,
I'm
so I think
sure
anything.
the
Mm-hmm.
time when I use this as an example for people, it was so funny, because people would be like, oh, so we should be afraid of you? And I'm like, yes. If
Yeah.
I chose to start a cult, I would know how to do it. It would be a good one. Come on.
Right.
Everyone's already standing in line to be in the nursing home with me and my mama when she is, 90 and I'm 75.
Right.
They're going to be like spinning the best yarns and spinning the best yarns.
Right.
But I'm always like, yeah, so don't come to my compound if I invite you,
Mm-hmm.
like, be skeptical. Even, what you're saying, like,
Yes.
I'm not saying like, oh, PhD programs are culty, abolish all doctorates, right?
Right.
But when you get in a program and your cult baby spidey sense is going off, like, listen
Yes.
to that and go find a place that's better for you.
And
I
that's
really
what
think
I
if we
did. Yeah.
know, like, what things are at risk for being culty, it allows
Mm-hmm.
us to, like, operate more safely in the world.
Agreed. I mean, I know, I know I'm telling people question everything, but that's just been so much of my experience as well.
Jamie,
Like that.
when you began to move away from the influence of your parents and you began to speak up for yourself, what was their response? Did you have a lot of family issues to deal with?
Still dealing with them, yes.
Yeah.
In fact, well, it's been an interesting journey. So the other fun part of my story is my brother's a Catholic priest. He ended up he was born after my dad's conversion. And in the conversations that we've had that I feel okay to share publicly, which I shared in the book, he just had the sense of I never really bought dad's religion and I always knew I was more Catholic. And he was the kid who was sneaking out to go to mass on a daily basis when he was 14. So he had some kind of calling. I don't know. Uh, I think he and I would have a closer relationship if he was more of a Joe Biden Catholic, but he has gone, let's just say, a more conservative path. with his
And, and
Catholicism.
and there seems to be a resurgence in that. I'm noticing.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
look at JD
students.
Vance.
Yeah, students of mine. Yeah, there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
JD Vance types among young men who
Yep.
are Catholics, and growing up in the evangelical South. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't have a lot of interactions with Catholic people, but my
Right.
limited interactions with them, I sort of saw as more progressive, liberal
Mm-hmm.
minded, what we would call, right, in our conservative circles, nominal Christians. But
Right.
now, as an adult, right, I'm hearing, especially from all of these young men. I mean, especially on social media. I mean, they're the guys that are um, quoting Marcus Aurelius and posting all the Chad memes,
Yeah.
and just very extreme in this masculinity
And
of
I'll tell you,
toxic
yeah.
masculinity.
And from having been in that world in graduate school, it's their play for getting their power needs met. I mean, I think that's what most of conservative, high demand, cultish expressions of faith are about, especially when you are a male, a white male, particularly, and you have this to hold over people. So I think that's a lot of what I'm saying. I mean, part of it is this mythical search for meaning, but it really is about a power play, is how I see it. Now, in terms of the rest of my family, it's just been very challenging. Like my father and I are presently no contact. We've been no contact off and on over the years. I just choose to no longer have a relationship with somebody who believes that I'm going to hell for being who I am. It's just not cool to me. And there's also a lot of there's always been a lot of conspiracy thinking with my father. Like the QAnon stuff, I I was hearing about this in the 80s. And I I just can't go along with it. My mother, as I write about in my memoir, she tends to adhere to the gospel of what people think. So even though she has honored and valued a lot of my struggles over the years, there can be this sense of, why do you have to talk about it? So yeah, it's been a challenging time with my immediate family, but I will say, as I've stepped more into the authenticity of myself and have spoken out, I have forged amazing relationships with my cousins. And they did not grow up with the religious conflict that I did, but they grew up with enough influence, especially of Catholic religion, where they and I have had a lot of great Me Too conversations since we've become adults. And I'm a firm believer as well in family of choice, which has certainly helped me in my healing, even if my immediate family. Daniela, my other shirt of yours I really love is the backslider shirt, because I really just would love to wear that to a family function one day.
Oh my gosh. Well, we'll get your information and I'll send you one. Um,
It's great.
just follow up with me. I was just writing in the chapter on entrance costs that one of the hidden subtle entrance costs to these high demand religions is giving up the freedom to choose what your family and your relationships look like.
Mm-hmm.
Right, because with so many religions. When I started off all of this comparison stuff, I would always just say, like, any version of telling consenting adults who they should or shouldn't be sleeping with, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
is more problematic than you think it's going to be, always, because it has so much to do with power dynamics.
Yes.
And that is every major religion, every branch of the US Army, many corporations, like it's all over. I saw this great meme once that just said, I just want Democrats to stay out of my pocketbook and Republicans to stay out of my bedroom.
Perfect.
uh,
Jamie, what are some of the ways that you are utilizing your experiences to help others today? What does that look like? You've mentioned your memoir many times. Tell us the
Oh
title
yeah,
of your
yeah.
memoir, and because I want to put it on my list for sure.
Yeah, I wrote a memoir called "You Lied to Me About God." It just came out October 15th of 2024. And it felt like a culmination of, because I've written many books in my field, especially around trauma, expressive arts, addiction. And I always say those previous books were very memoir-ish in that I didn't deny my lived experience. Yet I knew to write about spiritual abuse and religious trauma, which a lot of people who followed my work were asking for, I told my publisher, I have to do this as a memoir. I can't hide behind clinical language, even though I tend to be a more personal writer in how I write clinically. So, yeah, that's been the big step out. That's been what has felt like the biggest risk. Yet, leading up to this, because I've been training therapists on some level since 2008 or supervising them, I am always that one who is making sure that we name spiritual abuse as a legitimate form of abuse when we talk about other types of trauma. And it's really cool for me now to see it, especially as part of this evangelical movement, to hear these terms used more in my professions, like spiritual abuse, religious trauma. Church hurt is a term that's been going around, deconstructing and reconstructing. Because, yeah, when I first started my studies in 2003, we weren't talking about this. So I'm just glad that more of us are. And over the years, I have found that other therapists are either massively interested in hearing about this because they may have some lived experience in this area, or there were therapists who were like, oh, it has nothing to do with me. And then that's often to me a sign that it does, but there could either be allegiances to certain churches, certain family traditions, or just people not being aware that this is a legitimate form of abuse and trauma that they can claim.
That's what I was going to say. Or it's going to have something to do with their clients, right? And that's
Yes,
what
and
we
that's
have found
yeah,
in the deconstruction community, in the ex-cult community, is that there is quite a dearth of mental health professionals
right.
that understand. So first of all, I want to say more people are talking about it today because of people like you, right? Always making sure to talk about it and bring it up and write books about it. So, thank you for that. I'm one of these people that didn't realize that I needed to do religious deconstruction, because for me, I was like, oh, I just walked away from it at 15 and whatever, I'm fine, and for me, actually doing these channels has been understanding how much of an evangelical I actually am.
For sure.
Just in this more extreme form.
Yeah, and when I read your memoir or listened to your memoir, because I like audiobooks with memoir, because I had known about the Children of God, and I don't think I realized how much similarities of the evangelical extremism I had in common with folks like you who survived it, right?
And this is why I also want to call out this attitude of thinking that you can't, your professional experience is somehow worsened by adding your personal experience to it, right? Because that's what I was told. I was told by almost every mentor, right? Person in my life, very well meaning, right? Don't talk about the cult stuff. Nobody will take you seriously. That's what they
got so much of that.
You've done this cool stuff with the army. You're so smart. Just talk about that. And I was lucky. I had one mentor who, of course, we read about in the book, that was like, no, write about all of it, right? Talk about all of it. Everything is relevant.
Agreed.
And even, I think there's so many more authors that could be doing this kind of stuff that we're doing, which is yeah, you wrote a book, but you have all this knowledge, do more stuff with it, make more content. But going back to the, maybe it's this patriarchy idea, but selling through story works. Telling people ideas through story, that's how you get it to stick with them,
Let's go there, because a lot of that is just the academic BS of keep it professional, don't talk about this, people aren't going to know what to do with it, people aren't going to take you seriously. But I also have been exploring more how much of it is even the impact of being a hyper-religious, hyper-Christian nation, even on secular things like academia. Because so much of the church message is don't air the dirty laundry. Just forgive and move on. Don't talk about yourself, because then you're not giving God the credit. That's another message that comes through. And so maybe it does go back to it's a tool of the cult to keep people from sharing how things really are. Because I know in my academic, or in these circles I come from, because I've never been an academic classically, but I have hung out in enough professional clinical contexts where a lot of people look at me skeptically because I have shared so candidly about what I experience. But enough people have been helped by it. And so, yeah, we've come a long way, but there's a long way to go in professional therapy around these
and we've
issues.
seen this really interestingly in women in the military, right? So like when I
Yeah.
was deployed on my second deployment in 2014, I would still spend a lot of time talking with the psych about how we're still in this mode of you ladies asked to be here, right? So don't complain, right? There was no valid conversation of like the experience of being deployed as a woman and how it was different for us and how our service was different, not by our own fault, right? But just like because it was
Yes.
inherently different and there were all these different things that were brought to the table. But now that there have been hundreds of women with Ranger tabs and they're all out there speaking about like how their experience was different, like now everyone's having this conversation. And so the cult itself is being forced to change the way that it like treats women. Of course, now we're probably going backward.
Yeah, because there's going to be a blowback. I mean, I've seen that in the way dissociative disorders are treated now that more of us are speaking out. But
And that was
in any
another thing
event,
I wanted to point out when we were
yeah.
talking about the control piece was that like even these big cults of the 60s and 70s and 80s, like this was a blowback to civil rights and
Yeah.
to more equality across the board. And people, you know, I say all the time, like cults are very patriarchal. I think maybe coercive control is patriarchal and it's this fear. But I also think that's the hope right now. So we do know that we're living through like the largest exodus of religion in American history. And that, you know, there was this study that showed that the more dogmatic religions keep their people more. And so I think like this is what's happening with the men, right? They're going like, oh no, the cracks are, you know, the writing's on the wall, if you will, right? Like it's all coming down and they are trying to hang on for dear life. But
Well, America is a
once
very
the cracks are
reactionary
in,
culture.
yeah.
And I think a lot of people's are reactionary, but I see it very much part of the American fabric that there's always going to be a reaction and a blowback when there's change. So we got to keep talking about this.
We sure
And
do.
that's a very important aspect of what you and Daniela and others like you are doing, whether on the internet. I did notice on your website that there are opportunities for collaboration. You also you speak as well as a prolific writer. What are some other ways that if someone is seeking help, they could find it in your work? Or other resources that you've developed?
Sure. One of my websites I want to plug is redefinetherapy.com. Redefinetherapy.com is basically everything I've done for free that is out there on the internet. So I do trainings for other therapists. I still have a small therapy practice, a pretty big consulting practice. But I always feel it's important to make sure people can access at least parts of my work, even if they can't, let's say, afford the books. So I have basically every podcast I ever do, I have it cataloged on that site. A lot of the skill videos that I have available on my YouTube channel, just search my name, you'll find me on YouTube. You can get on the Redefine Therapy site different articles, different blogs that I have out there. So that is a good resource to cite for people to go to if they want to connect further with my work, whether that is through a book, through working with me in some capacity, or just in enjoying what, I don't know if enjoying is the right word, taking part in what is out there online.
And I think that's an important aspect of what we do here, right? We're actually
Oh,
building
yeah.
community, so it becomes an opportunity for those of us that have experienced the spiritual abuse, the trauma of these cults and high control groups to come together and hear other stories, and that validates not only your experience, but it also offers you hope for a productive future outside of that group.
And I think that's important because I know when I was growing up in this, now I have the words to name it. At the time it was just this awful, dreadful feeling that there was something wrong with me because I wasn't getting it. because I wasn't picking up on it, that I must be this flawed demon spirit of some kind. And now to hear people share and hear similar themes and the hey, I relate to that experience, I personally find that to be one of the most powerful forces for healing.
Yeah. There's a psychological term for it. Maybe you know, because I can never remember, but it's like for our human tendency to think that our experiences only happen to us, but then once we like hear it said out loud or like read it in a book or something, we start to understand that like a lot of people have had that experience.
There is a term for that. It's escaping me at the moment too.
Because I literally remember learning about it in my class on self and identity, and I was like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, that's why I like doing what I do. I think that
Right.
I always say for me, it's like I have such an extreme story. So we all agree this is a cult. But if I don't say it's a cult and you're just reading my story, going through it, and you're relating, then like, yes, and you can't lie to yourself when your mind knows that you're relating to a story or to an experience. Um,
Correct.
and
Yeah.
by the way, I think if you ever did like a spiritual abuse memoir book club, you would have like a lot of people. That's like, I've been doing like cult memoir book clubs, and just have found like people are just really interested because you do like start to notice these patterns, but then also
Yep.
get like the language and context to
Yep.
describe your own experience from like hearing someone else talk about what happened to them.
Well, I do have a course coming up, if I can plug it, on writing spiritual
Sure.
memoir. I don't know
Amazing.
when this will air, but I have it's starting in January, and it's just based on this whole idea that because yeah, I think a book club is powerful in and of itself that you can read other people's work and connect to it. Yet I feel memoir works at its best when it's not just trauma porn, because I think there's a lot of memoirs that's kind of it.
Mm-hmm.
But memoir works at its best when somebody can read it or listen to it and have those moments of connection and then hopefully be able to share their own story. So, like, even in my memoir, at the end of every chapter, I have an expressive arts practice that people can engage in to hopefully better articulate a little bit more of their spiritual autobiography. And so I'm calling the teaching I'm doing in this area memoir writing a spiritual practice because a lot of people who come out of high demand religion or cults or whatever really are looking for some healthier outlet to express their spiritual selves. And I think all writing and expressive arts can be a valuable point of that. I think everybody has a story to share. It may not be something that gets published or something you even want to have published or out there. But that's a lot of what I'll be doing and teaching on this. And I'm definitely going to be making recommendations of other cult memoir, spiritual abuse memoir that have impacted me.
Well, yeah, this is great. And the link for this class that she's teaching will be in the show notes. I recommend this to people all the time. I say, do it as an investment in yourself and your healing. Take a writing class, right? Like, even if
Mm-hmm.
you don't end up writing a story, I think like deconstruction through writing a memoir is a whole different type of writing. Of course, I want to
Oh,
acknowledge those of you that
yes.
have journaling trauma, like my Mormon sibs from another crib. Like,
Yeah.
you do not have to do writing if that's not your cup of tea, but I think
Yep.
investing in a class like this can be really great. I also do have 2 copies of your book, which I will be reading in Devotions with Daniela soon. So when I start that, because I think your publisher sent me one and then you sent me one. So when I start
Oh,
that, I'm
cool.
going to be raffling one of them away on my Patreon. So check out the links for my Patreon. That's also where I run Cult Memoir Book Club and Cult Theory Book Club through. So if anyone is interested in those, we have a good time not even pulling people's memoirs apart, just reading them and then
Mm-hmm.
talking about our own experiences and like finding the tactics and learning the techniques of cults, and all of that. Definitely super, super excited for people to read your book as well. And those will be linked all of this will be linked in the show notes.
Dr. Jamie Marich, thank you so much for joining us. We've just scratched the surface, and perhaps we can have you back at some future time to continue this conversation.
Anytime. I love what you're doing in the world, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And to all of our listeners, all of our viewers, do us a favor and hit that like button. Be sure and share and subscribe and leave us a rating. It helps with the analytics to get the word out about what we're doing here on the podcast. Until next time, for Daniela Mestenek Young, the Knitting Cult Lady, I'm Scott Lloyd. We'll see you on the next episode of Cults and the Culting of America.